Hello and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. Before we get started, a word about our upcoming episodes. On Tuesday, June 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll welcome George Lovegrove to the show. George is a crypto/Web3 developer from the UK who currently resides in Dubai. He is the founder of the Web3 Association, which exists to provide information and expertise relating to the creation and management of digital token ecosystems. George and I first connected last year in connection with the ideas of Silvio Gesell. George had a different perspective on Gesell's proposal for demurrage currency as an ideal treasury funding model for cryptocurrencies. This was something I'd never even considered before, and since connecting, George and I have had extensive conversations and have begun some promising collaborations. George is also the creator of an alternative economic model he calls contributionism. And then on Tuesday, July 1st at 1 p.m., we'll be doing something new and different. We'll be holding our first roundtable episode in which we'll have 4 guests rather than just 1. 3 of those guests have appeared in past episodes. Those 3 are Will Ruddick, Toyin von Sambeek, and George Lovegrove, who I just mentioned. The 4th guest is Michael Meehan, who has not appeared on the show before, but who I work closely with on the Silvio Gesell Foundation. The topic of the episode will be how to build digital exchange models based on trust. Bitcoin, for example, is based on the ideal of creating a trustless network where it's assumed that the participants do not trust each other. Each of the participants in the roundtable are, in their own different ways, pursuing the opposite approach. How we can leverage the emerging potentialities of decentralized digital exchange systems to enable us, perhaps for the first time in human history, to extend trust-based dynamics beyond the limits of small groups in which the members are all personally known to each other. I hope that roundtable episodes will become a regular feature of this series, in which we'll bring together guests who have previously appeared on the show in order to compare, contrast, and debate their different perspectives on particular topics. Okay, for anyone joining us for the first time, Economy 2.0 is meant to be a conversation. Anyone in the live Zoom audience is welcome to join the conversation at any time. To do so, just click the Raise Hand button under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. If you have your camera turned on, I'll bring you on screen when it's your turn. You're free to use the Zoom chat, but I won't be able to read the chat and it will not be included in the recording. So if you have something to say, I encourage you to raise your hand and join the conversation. A reminder that these episodes are recorded and will be published on the YouTube channels of both the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. Okay, let's bring in today's guest. Dr. Willem Buiter is an independent economic advisor, speaker, and commentator. He's had an extraordinary career in both the financial industry and academia, holding positions at Yale, Princeton, Cambridge, and the London School of Economics, as well as being the Chief Global Economist at Citigroup from 2010 to 2018. He's the author or co-author of 78 peer-reviewed articles and 8 books. Dr. Buiter, welcome to Economy 2.0. I don't know how familiar you are with the series, if at all, so I'd like to start by describing the premise and orientation of the show. The theme of Economy 2.0 is twofold. First, it's an examination of the economic status quo from the perspective of those who believe that the current system is dysfunctional and likely to systemically fail. And secondly, to explore alternative models which could potentially replace the conventional system if and when it ceases to function. In this context, you're a bit of an unusual guest. Most of our guests come from outside of the conventional economic system, whereas your career has been one of great success working within that system. That being said, I think it's important to include all different perspectives in this conversation. We don't want to create an echo chamber that consists only of people who see the existing system as irredeemable and certain to collapse. If there's a case to be made in favor of the status quo, that needs to be part of the conversation as well. And furthermore, despite your mainstream success, you've also been quite critical of important aspects of the conventional system throughout your career. So first, in order for us to understand where you're coming from, let me pose the question of whether you view the status quo as sustainable. Do you believe the challenges we face can be addressed via so-called incremental reforms, or do you share my belief and that of many previous guests on this show that the conventional system is bound to fail under the weight of its own contradictions, and that therefore incrementalism is pointless or even counterproductive, and that we should instead be focusing on building new models and systems from the ground up?
Well, the existing economic system is, I think, indeed very vulnerable. If you look at the two areas that I have spent much of my research on, which is fiscal sustainability and the effective use of monetary policy as a counter-cyclical demand management tool, then we're in trouble on these two dimensions. And that trouble reflects deeper underlying socio-political problems. I mean, fiscal unsustainability is a feature of modern advanced economies as well as many developing countries and emerging markets. And, the debt of the sovereign is exploding. A lot of debt is not recognized. Governments mismanage their assets. And the picture is for one of large-scale sovereign debt default by major countries, or, and that's the alternative for countries like the US, demonetization, Argentina-style, pre-Milei of these public debt and deficits, leading to absence of formal default, but de facto default through very high inflation. And, this problem can only be addressed if we create a consensus on what the state can spend and who will pay for it and how. And that consensus is gone. And until we establish that, I think we're going to be in trouble, because I actually think while there is much waste in the public sector, I think that on balance, aging populations, environmental requirements, and other fiscal demands mean that public spending will have to rise as a share of GDP. And I see nobody raising their hand and say, we will pay for that. In a world where, in the same political entity, you have billionaires and people that live on the street and can't feed themselves, to find a consensus on the fair distribution of the collective social burden of public spending is very hard to find. So we need political reform as well as economic reform. I'll get back to the monetary issue later. The negative interest rates are a big part of what I have in mind to enhance the effectiveness of monetary policy. But let me stop here.
Yeah, I certainly want to get into the nuts and bolts of your ideas on monetary policy and the conventional money creation process. But before that, let's talk in broader terms. How do you hope that the world will grapple with and solve the problems that you just described?
Well, I have hope, but not much of an expectation. I hope that the next generation who will be leading our world politically, socially, economically, will be both smarter and more capable of designing collective mechanisms than my generation has been, and even the generation of my parents before me. We have a world in which resources, in principle, are ample to get everybody to live a decent life, provided it's properly managed, income and wealth are properly distributed, and effective demand management policies are in place globally. We are not there. I have hope. I look at my children and think that they are probably smarter than I am, but that's about as good as it gets. I see very little evidence at the moment with Trump in the United States, with my country of origin, the Netherlands, just having another government collapse over issues of restrictive immigration and sort of anti-alien policies. And Gazelle thought people should have the right to live anywhere on the world. That's part of the free land doctrine. We have never, in my lifetime, moved so far away from that. The petty nationalism, anti-foreigner, anti-alien sentiment is still in the ascendant. This has to change. And it's up to, as I said, the younger generations to stand up and do this.
Do you envision them accomplishing that by working through existing institutions or by another approach, which a number of past guests on this show have advocated for, including my own orientation, which is to conclude that the existing institutions cannot be reformed, and that therefore the approach that makes the most sense is to withdraw our energies and our participation from those institutions, and to start building new systems based on different models from the ground up, perhaps at a local level, perhaps at a digital level, perhaps both, but with the hope and expectation that by withdrawing our energies from what are currently the ascendant institutions, that those forces will lose power and kind of just wither and be organically replaced by something else? Or do you think that those systems are still susceptible to productive reform, and that it's perhaps overly idealistic to imagine that we can create something new, and that our energies are better spent participating in those institutions?
I believe that creating a alternative parallel universe using digital media and whatever else we can come up with is not a realistic part of the solution. I think people should organize using all the new tools and techniques available in order to participate more effectively in existing institutions. Some reforms are possible. In the US, the Congress, the legislature, has ceded too much power over a period of many decades to the executive. Right? That has to be restored. And I think a combination of legal action and legislative action can do that. I think the problem is not necessarily that the existing institutions are fatally flawed, but that participation in these institutions is is so limited. And it's very important that people recognize that participation in political institutions is a moral duty. Individual rationality, right, would never get anybody to go out and vote, right? Because why would my vote make any difference to the outcome? Right? I could stay home and have a coffee instead. Right? So as a citizen, you have a duty to go out. And if necessary, if you don't like any of the candidates, you sign in your own or you abstain, but you do turn out. This is civic responsibility. The same applies in other areas of political participation. At the local level, managing everything from law and order to garbage collection and to making sure that environmental standards are met, right? A lot more popular involvement in the existing institutions would improve them. So I really think the main thing is that we must incentivize people to make better use of the tools they have, which have been increasingly neglected by too many.
Okay. I'm going to push back on that a little bit because I'm one of those people who has observed the conventional system for decades, who has participated in it earlier in life and uh, progressively withdrawn from it. So I would ask you, if I take your statement to heart that it is my responsibility to participate, um, who should I support? Who can you point to as an example of a candidate, a party, a movement that that you think is worthy of support by virtue of the fact that they are offering concrete solutions to specific problems and that we can get behind in order to improve the status quo?
I do think that in the countries I'm most familiar with, which is the United States, UK, where I have citizenship, the Netherlands, where my country of origin, Belgium, where I spent 10 years. In none of these countries are there obvious individuals or political parties that have a recipe, a menu, an agenda that could work. The response to that would not be I drop out, but I set up my own political party, running for the parliament within these institutions. I make my own um, social, political, economic agenda. And I proselytize it using the web and social media, right? But Um, I will implement it, if necessary, by standing myself for elective office, running for a judgeship, or taking some other visible um, role in power sharing. We have to get more people willing and to invest in and participate in the management of power.
Okay, let's then get a little more specific. As you know, this show is a collaboration between the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School.
Mhm.
Those organizations advocate for specific programs of fundamental reform of the capitalist system.
Mhm.
Um, in the case of the Henry George perspective, that is mostly focused on the issue of land ownership. And in the case of Silvio Gesell, it is a combination of land ownership and reform of our form of money. Since your expertise is money, let's talk about that. That's how you and I first connected as a representative of the perspective of Silvio Gesell. This past year, you were awarded the first Silvio Gesell Prize to recognize your decades-long scholarship in this field. You've written papers um, exploring the subject of negative interest rates as being a necessary part of the central banking toolkit, and recognizing Silvio Gesell as an important um, intellectual support for that policy option. My question for you would be, as someone who has spent a significant number of years within the conventional system, um, do you do you advocate for the current model of money creation? This is a topic which I perceive is quite timely. I think more and more people are in quite recently coming to the understanding that what most of us learned in the economics textbooks uh, is not how the real world works. Most conventional economics textbooks teach us that money is created by the central bank, and that banks are financial intermediaries. That, I assume you would agree, is not an accurate description of how most money comes into existence. Um, in our current system, most money comes into existence out of thin air through the lending of private sector banks. Um, do you think that that is a legitimate function that government has allowed private banks to assume?
Um, I personally believe that the creation and management of money is a public good. Right? And public goods, on the whole, are not well provided for, well managed by private agents, unless they're severely constrained. So the fact, as you point out, that most money in modern economies takes the form of bank deposits, right? Withdrawable, on demand, in principle at a fixed price on a first come, first served basis. Created by institutions that are, in addition to moneymakers, are intermediaries between households and corporations, between savers and investors. I think the creation of money and serious financial intermediation should be separate from each other, should be institutionally separate. So, and the good news is that thanks to modern technology, and the digital networks that they can create, both traditional, centralized digital networks and new DeFi networks, we now have a way of providing a really efficient, functioning money that does the job of acting as medium of exchange for virtually everybody in any transaction. We can do that without having to either rely on ancient technologies like paper currencies or on private intermediation, which may be digital, but still is part of the intermediation process, which it should not be of. Because banks provide this essential good, money, they have to be protected from runs and from speculative attacks. And so we have deposit insurance, we have lender of last resort, we have special resolution regimes for banks. All that favors banks unduly, makes for unfair competition. So the government responds to that by more restrictive regulation of banks. But that interferes with intermediation. So if you just could take the creation of money away from banks and also get rid of paper money, but that's a minor technical issue, away from banks and rely instead on a central bank digital currency to facilitate most transactions, or even to allow some private credits to act as money, but only if they are 100% backed by central bank reserves. That would be the only private provision of money. When that's the case, banks no longer have this unusual essentiality for economic life, don't have to be protected or overregulated, and we get a much more efficient financial system. So I would go and do two things. One, get rid of paper currency. Because paper currency, which pays a zero interest rate, sets a floor on the nominal interest rates that can be charged on other financial instruments. Yes, I know it's possible, in principle, to follow the stamp script recipe of Silvio Gesell and paying interest, positive or negative, on money by stamping it. But I think that is a complex, intrusive, and quite costly procedure. Having a central bank digital currency which pays interest, positive or negative, as the economy may demand, which is available online and offline. So people that don't have internet access can still have the CDC on the card and handle it the way they would pay with cash physical cash today. Right? In addition, there's no limitations on the size of the balances you can keep in the central bank digital currency or on the size of the transactions you can make. This would be an extremely attractive currency, which would also be a more effective instrument for monetary policy management because it could set interest rates, if necessary, at deeply negative levels to stimulate demand.
Okay, well, I certainly agree with a lot of that. I'm curious how how your ideas were received when you were working for Citigroup, since you're essentially saying that their fundamental business model has to completely change in order for us to have uh, a monetary system that works properly. Did you speak about that?
I spoke about negative interest rates and how to implement them quite regularly, but I did not at the time focus as much on this conflict between private financial institutions engaged in meaningful financial intermediation that also are supposed to provide the money withdrawal on demand on a first come, first served basis at a fixed price. So the notion that this would take Citi's business away didn't arise when I was there. So the only sort of mildly radical thing I proposed at that time was the abolition of paper cash and currency, to take away the zero lower bound, or as it should really be called, the effective lower bound, because you can go slightly negative. The Bank of the Swedish central bank had a deposit rate at one point of minus 1.25%. Its official rate never went below 50, but its deposit rate went to minus 1.25%. That's because there are carry costs of physical currency, storage, safekeeping, insurance, whatnot. But it sets the floor, I think, at around minus 50 basis points or minus 75 basis points, perhaps. The Fed and the Bank of England didn't even take advantage of that, right? The Fed's federal funds rate, the target zone never went below zero, and the Brits never went below 0.1%. So they didn't even go mildly negative. Very incomprehensible. So again, the answer to your question is I did not really think of this conflict between meaningful financial private intermediation and the provision of a currency. That's something I've only become aware of in the years since I left Citi.
Okay. I want to get into the specifics of all of what you just described, the ability of central banks to use negative interest rates as part of their toolkit. But first, I want to go back to the question of how these questions relate to what we were talking about previously, which is political participation. What you're describing and what I agree with, and what Silvio Gesell and Henry George both advocated for, which is the idea that the creation of money is is a the provision of a public good and is the proper function of the government. That means completely overhauling our financial system. And I'm not aware of anyone in any elected office or any established political party who is advocating for that, with the possible exception of Dennis Kucinich. I know that that money reform is a big interest of him, and I think his wife as well. But if I'm a young person who's just coming out of college with an interest in economics, who wants to productively engage with this subject, how would you advise that I do that?
Well, first, I think the gut level opposition to negative interest rates and to the abolition of paper currency and coins has to be overcome. And people have to talk about it and convince first themselves, then their neighbors, then members in the neighborhood, that there is nothing unnatural about negative nominal interest rates. Why should the price of money today, in money terms, be higher than the value tomorrow? I mean, we have had negative real interest rates many times in the past 200 years. Huh? The economy sometimes calls for a deeply negative policy rate to stimulate aggregate demand. Without that, you either get stuck for extended periods unnecessarily in recession or depression, or you have to use expansionary fiscal policy, which may not be appropriate given your debt sustainability situation. So it is, I think, the argument for creating a system that permits negative interest rates is a complete no-brainer. And I must say, I'm very disappointed that the Fed and the ECB both, when they talk about introducing a central bank digital currency, say they're going to have it non-interest bearing. And again, they've also both said abolish paper currency. And finally, they've also basically said, at least the Bank of England, sorry, that's the ECB, European Central Bank, has said that they will cap the size of an account that a CBDC account holder could have. So they are emasculating, neutering this eminently feasible, implementable tomorrow set of reforms, which says create central bank digital currency at a retail level, interest bearing. Anybody can open an account with the central bank or an account of the central bank managed on their behalf by private or public financial entities, including post offices and all that. Okay? But all guaranteed by the central bank. So they are central bank deposits effectively. Allow them to pay positive as well as negative interest rates. So enhance your monetary policy arsenal when there is excessive unemployment, when inflation is below target, or indeed when your currency is overvalued, you can go down as far as you need to go, even in deeply negative territory. I am very surprised that a reform which is so technically trivial, now that we have blockchain-based private currencies to show how it would be done, right? That they can say, no, we're not going to do any of this. The public opposition to the abolition of currency has some valid arguments going for it. Currency gives you privacy and anonymity. Right? I don't need to know who gives me a $10 note when I buy it. As long as the note is a valid one, yeah, that's it. So transactions and holdings can be anonymous. And libertarians and all those who fear an overly intrusive and possibly repressive and totalitarian government like that privacy. And I can see that. At the same time, of course, the privacy and anonymity associated with paper currency makes it the preferred means of payment and store of value for crime in all dimensions. Right? Tax evasion, funding of terrorism, whatever. So, and the good news is that if you value this anonymity, we can create something very similar with the central bank digital currency by putting it on the blockchain in a permissionless fashion. Right? So the central bank would have to know what wallet the, um, the, the CBDC holdings are in so that they can pay interest, positive or negative, but they don't have to know the identity of the beneficial owner of the wallet. So you could have um, some form of anonymity if you made the CBDC operate on a permissionless blockchain. I would prefer the permissioned blockchain, but that's at least for those countries where governments aren't totally evil. um, and you know, and but you don't have to be afraid of somebody identifying you as the holder of certain balances. But yes, it is eminently feasible. It could be done at very short notice, and it could even have these positive side effects by introducing CBDC that can be used for transactions offline as well as online, that anybody who is totally dependent on physical currency today has this very substitute of cash on the card for physical cash.
All right, I want to reiterate my question one last time, and then I promise I will let go of it. But what I did not hear is any specific advice to a recent college graduate with an interest in economics of how they can engage with this subject other than to encourage, engage in discussion, public education, which is what we're doing here. This is the purpose
Make
of
it a political issue, right? Decide which political party you are closest to, go in there and put it on the agenda. Say, we want a central bank to have the means to pay deeply negative interest rate should this be economically appropriate. We cannot do this at the moment because we have zero interest currency, and because central banks have been slow, frightfully slow, in introducing central bank digital currencies. Why we don't have these things already in this country and most of the advanced economies is incomprehensible. They have them in Africa, but not yet in the place where they should be used first. So I think you have to become politically active. You have to become a citizen, a serious citizen, spending your time and your effort on changing the decision-making process and getting your preferred reforms implemented. There is no alternative.
All right. We've got a raised hand, so let me bring in Giannis. Giannis, go ahead. You're muted, so turn your microphone on and welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Willem, for coming and presenting, and thank you, Josh, for hosting. I have two questions on your criticisms of the paper money system, right? And of course, you claim that because criminals use it, we should do away with it and forfeit the privacy that it provides. Number one, there is no digital platform of any sort that can be effectively encrypted. And even if it did, there are many ways. I mean, we recently had a case in New York where actually an owner of a crypto account, of course, was found, and then there was a case of blackmail and torture in order to have them forfeit their cryptocurrency. So actually, there is nowhere to hide. Now, for the paper money, though, the only problem I see with the paper money is stashing it. Like the proverbial putting it under the mattress, either because you are afraid, you don't know what to do, blah, blah, blah. And that way, the economy is bled of monetary blood that would circulate and create transactions. But I think that can easily be resolved by retiring the paper money like every, I would say, 10 years. Maybe we can make it 20 years, in which case people will have actually to take the money out of their mattresses and recirculate it. And it will reappear in the economy, and that would create. So I don't see any problems with why we should give up the paper money. On the other hand, electronic transactions are notorious for being manipulated for political reasons. And we saw that in Canada. We saw that, demonetization, debanking, you say the wrong thing. In Europe also, in China, sorry, social credits, you're not a good boy, you're not going to be able to buy at the store. So I'm really I want to bring the criticism to these digital technologies, which you tout, and of course they sound promising, that they could solve some of the issues. So can you respond to this criticism?
Yes. First, there's the issue of the security of digital wallets, whether they are on a permissionless blockchain like Bitcoin, supposedly providing anonymity to the owner of the wallet, or whether they are on a permissioned blockchain where they would be like regular accounts in a centralized economy. And then which one you prefer would simply depend on which one is technologically more efficient. I am aware of the fact that security can never be absolute, but the same holds true for paper currency. I mean, we've had major forgeries throughout human history, right? In World War II, fake sterling and fake D-marks were distributed by both sides in the equation. So I think the security issue is one to take seriously, especially with the new developments that we are about to enter with sort of nanotechnologies, and where the power of both encrypting and decrypting increases exponentially. But I'm confident. I've for 55 years or more run accounts electronically, without ever being interfered with, either by thugs, private thugs, or by the government. If you have a repressive or totalitarian government, they will get at you no matter what your currency is. Remember, if they want to go after you with physical currency, they can simply declare all physical currency to be no longer a legal tender and at risk of being confiscated at will by the authority. So security of the physical currency is limited. What physical currency does not permit, except through these very labor-intensive and intrusive stamp script methods, stamping currency notes, proposed by Gazelle and also taken on by Irving Fisher and others since then. I do think these are too clumsy and intrusive, and I would prefer a central bank digital currency, which takes away the provision of this public good, an efficient, generally available means of payment, instantaneously available, low negligible transactions cost, to make the provision of this public good independent of private intermediation. And so the CBDC for me is the way to do it. I can see that there are risks, but I think they are no greater than the risks associated with the retention of paper currency.
Dr. Buiter, just to make sure that I understand your position, am I correct in understanding that your primary, if not sole, reason for advocating for the elimination of physical currency is because it limits the flexibility of central banks to set negative interest rates, because cash by definition pays zero nominal interest?
Yes, I have two reasons for wanting a CBDC to take the place of paper cash. The first is that I want to get rid of the effective lower bound on interest rates. I want the central bank to be able to set, when cyclically appropriate, deeply negative nominal interest rates. But in addition, on the privacy and anonymity front, I'm actually take the opposite view. I think that the damage created through the criminal and illegal use of paper currency outweighs any benefits it may have. So I see this as a major blow to organized and indeed to disorganized crime.
Okay. We've got another hand raised. Jamal, if you would like to join the screen, you'll need to turn your camera on. There you go. Let me add you. All right, Jamal, welcome. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, and thank you for joining the seminar. I'm learning a lot going to each of these seminars. So my question was, for your implementation of central bank digital currencies, would it be possible for something outside or below the national government to try to implement this? Because I know there in the United States, there's public banks like the Bank of South Dakota, which is a government-owned bank that gives out loans to local communities, as well as there's local currencies like Berkshires, which is a type of local currency that's in the northeastern part of the United States. So part of what I've been trying to research and try to look up is, could you put a full reserve bank that issues out digital currencies on, say, a community and have their own local currency that implements demurrage? And would that have the same effect or a similar effect as what would happen on a national level?
I'm not at all opposed to the provision of private digital currencies, as long as they are truly 100% backed by the safest asset or, in the wider national jurisdiction. So you could not do this as part of the operations of a bank that engages in lending operations to the private sector or purchases securities from businesses and all that. So I would require anybody who provides their own digital currency to have them exchangeable at par and on demand into central bank money. So this still would leave, of course, the private provider whose money deposits are backed 100% by central bank reserves. It would still allow the private provider to be competitive with the central bank if you provide superior technology, faster payments, cheaper payments, better international payments. So there's still a lot of competition on the technology and the efficiency of the mechanism. So I would not object to private digital currencies as long as I said they are 100% backed by central bank reserves.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Jamal. Got another hand raised. Sebastian, if you'd like to be on the screen, you'll need to turn your camera on. If not, yeah, there you go. Let me add you to the screen. Sebastian, welcome. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Willem. Thank you so much. Very exciting commentaries. I have a very naive question, super naive. Why build monetary policy assuming that it will be used for bad and creating all the permission and permissionless conundrums, and not allow a monetary policy believing that the users will be acting in goodwill, which would be a very different kind of monetary policy than implementing rules that are specifically punishing the misbehavior, which then condition the economic model for a minority. I believe that's my naive. I don't know how much of the monetary system is used for bad and how much is used for good.
And this is not the question of wanting to subsidize, encourage good economic behavior and discourage bad economic behavior. For all I know, the money on my CBDC, on somebody's CBDC account with the central bank, could be used to purchase illegal drugs, right? Or to arrange for terrorism. Oh, that's possible. What I'm saying here, I want the central bank to have the power, should this be desirable from the point of view of economic stabilization policy, to have deeply negative rates to set them that way. Rates would not be negative, at least I assume, most of the time, right? Because most estimates of what is called the risk-free real interest rate, or the neutral real interest rates, are a positive, ranging, say, from 0.5% to 2%. And that means that the sort of standard, the normal, the expected nominal policy rate would be this neutral real interest rate plus the inflation target, 2%. So that means that I would expect the interest rate on bank deposits to be between 2.5% and 4% when the economy is at full employment, inflation is on target, and the current account is in equilibrium. But I want, if there is above normal, above desirable unemployment, or below target inflation, or if for some reason the neutral real interest rate falls and becomes negative, which it may, I want the authorities to be able to cut the rate to whatever level, even negative if necessary, to stimulate demand. So all we want, I want the negative interest rate option for, is to have the ability to stimulate aggregate demand. That's it. Not good behavior, bad behavior.
Another interesting idea would be to have specific interest rates per industrial sector, because having one interest rate for the entire economy is cumbersome, and you benefit one side but then not the other one. So it would be it would create more fluidity and more dynamic model if each sector could determine what interest rate they need for their own interest, for their own activity.
Clearly, even in our sort of integrated financial system, different economic entities, even the same industry, can pay different borrowing rates because their default risk is perceived to be different. But I would argue that I would not want in integrated financial economy like the US to have different risk-adjusted interest rates for different economic entities, because funds are fungible, and the cheap funds would be on lent to whoever wanted to pay more for it. So I do think that you cannot make different interest rates on loans available to economic entities whose economic activities have the same risk properties and whose risk of not repaying it in full is the same. I would want that to be normalized.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sebastian. We've got another hand raised. Walter Perry, if you want to join the screen, you'll need to turn your camera on. If not, you can just go ahead and make your comment or question.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you well.
Professor, what is it that makes an illegal drug illegal?
Oh, that's very simple. That's the law, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's undesirable, because in the past, substances have been declared illegal that were quite desirable. But what I was talking about when I said that anonymity allows you to engage in criminal activity, including buying and selling illegal drugs, I meant drugs that, in addition to being illegal, do substantively more harm than good.
Who decides that?
It's a social decision.
But who specifically in the society you envision
Well, in this particular,
decides that there is more harm than good?
no,
And
that would
decides
be
the force of law should be suborned for that purpose.
that would be decided through the political process, would be legislated, and
But what standing does the
by the
political
executive.
process have to do that?
Sorry?
Whence derives the authority?
I believe that nations, or whatever the political entity is, elected, legitimate executive, legislature, and judiciary have the right to legislate and enforce rules of behavior that include banning certain substances because they are deemed damaging to public health.
But in the United States, at least in theory, at least constitutionally, we do not have a Westphalian nation state. Quite the contrary. I'm sorry?
Okay.
We do not have a Westphalian nation state. In fact, we left Europe in the 17th century because the 30 Years' War convinced us of the fundamental evil of the Westphalian nation state. In the end, all they can do is make war on each other over ideological differences, religious war. The United States is predicated on a very different assumption, that the sovereignty rests with the people, except for certain limited and enumerated powers, which the people have devolved upon a tightly prescribed, specifically enumerated state. So I ask you again, in the United States, where does the authority derive to declare that this risk reward, as perceived by this observer, justifies this coercive action by the state?
I'm going to step in for just 1 second. Willem, I want to know if you want to follow this line of discussion. I have no problem with it, but it does seem to me to be going quite off the track that we were.
This goes towards federalism versus Unitarian states and all that. And I'm a firm Unitarian in my outlook on politics. I feel that federal states are simply a somewhat more decentralized way of managing what is fundamentally a single political entity. That's how I view the US, of which I am a citizen. If
you're a union, we are not a single political entity, as that is understood by Europeans with the paradigm of the Westphalian nation state.
I disagree, but
constitutionally, there is no basis for your disagreement.
No,
maybe you
there certainly is. But let's maybe discuss this some other time.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I agree.
I do believe that these things, in the United States, they would either be decided at the federal level, or at the state level, if they haven't been delegated to the federal level, or for that matter, they could be decided at the local level, where local authorities have powers of regulation and enforcement. So, I say at whatever level of government is appropriate, but there has to be one level that can decide this.
All right.
And
I'd like to, Walter, we're gonna move on from this. I'd like to return to the subject of money and interest, and I want to read to you an excerpt from Gassell's book and hear your thoughts on it. Gassell wrote, "Metal money has been in existence for 4,000 years, has during 100 generations passed through thousands of millions of hands. Yet in the management of money, every country in the world is guided not by science, but simply by routine. The lack of a sound theory of money is the reason why the phenomenon of interest has never been satisfactorily explained. For 4,000 years, we have paid and received countless thousands of millions in interest, yet science is at the present day incapable of answering the question, whence and why does the capitalist receive interest? Attempts to solve the problem have not indeed been wanting. As an obvious disturber of the peace, interest has received a far larger share of public and scientific attention than money. All economists of note have dealt with this problem, especially the socialists, whose whole effort is fundamentally directed against interest. But in spite of all these attempts, the problem of interest remained unsolved. The failure is not due to the difficulty of the subject, but to the fact that capital interest is the child or byproduct of our traditional form of money and can therefore be scientifically explained only with the help of a theory of money. Money and interest, to superficial observers inseparable friends, have also a close interconnection, a connection in theory. A theory of interest can only be deduced from a theory of money." So my first question to you is, it's a dual question. Do you agree that that was an accurate statement at the time when Gassell wrote it, which would have been in the first decade of the 20th century, I believe, that the causes for the existence of interest had not been worked out? And do you agree that that statement remains true to the present day? Do you believe that there is a scientific consensus as to why interest exists?
Oh, yes. I quite strongly disagree with the statement like I said that basically the theory of interest can only be based on a theory of money. An interest rate is an intertemporal relative price, right? And as long as there's time and as long as there are goods and services available at different points in time, we can establish a price today for the delivery of that commodity tomorrow that implies the interest rate for this commodity. And that's true even in economies where this was not recognized. Basically, economies consisting largely of subsistence farming and all that. But in modern economies, including when Gassell was writing, which was the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the first few decades of the 20th century, I think interest rates, intertemporal relative prices were, I think, recognized, and there was nothing anomalous about them. sometimes, they were too high in the sense that the markets and whatever monetary fiscal policy is being conducted generate an interest rate so high that it depressed investment demand and other economic activity and led people to hoard unproductive assets, which could be financial assets as well. And this became even clearer when money as it became a significant asset, when many monies, commodity monies, gold, did have interest rates attached to them, right? Since the price of the commodity can vary over time, that defines the rate of return, the implicit interest rate on the commodity. For the monetary asset, the paper money asset that was prominent in Gazelle's time, the zero nominal interest rate was an anomaly because you could not change the nominal price of money over time. The price of money, in terms of money today, was the same as well. So it was important that since monetary policy became a central element in demand management, that in periods of excess demand and excessive inflation, the monetary authorities should be able to raise the interest rate on non-monetary assets, on central bank reserves, and therefore on all private assets that were substitutes for this asset, raise them to the level necessary. But of course, they found that they could not do this when the economy required stimulus and the interest rate of bank reserves was at zero, just below it, because if you put it any lower, everybody would rush into cash, which was a better store of value because it offered zero rather than the negative rate available on central bank money and possibly other private money. So the need for since government money, central bank money, plays such a central role in economic activity, it's a key store of value as well as being means of payment. We want the policy authority to be able to set the nominal interest rate at any negative level necessary. And this was true in Gazelle's time and before that. Metal money doesn't change that.
Okay, I agree with your statement that there will always be temporal preferences to real wealth, and if interest is understood to be an expression of those preferences, then yes, it is an organic and natural phenomenon. But Gazelle's perspective, as I understand it, relates to the persistence of a positive rate of interest. You earlier in the discussion referred to the fact that real interest rates over history tend to always be in the neighborhood of 0.5% to 2%. And surely you're aware of Gazelle's Robinson Crusoe story, which is meant to make the case that positive interest rates are not consistent with the laws of nature. And he creates this variation on the story of Robinson Crusoe, where Crusoe has accumulated a store of real wealth, including grain, including buckskins, and then a second shipwreck survivor appears on the island naked and in need of Crusoe's accumulated capital. And the survivor, Crusoe makes the attempt to extract interest, offering to loan his capital in exchange for interest, because where he's from, that's how you do it. And the stranger makes the argument that Crusoe will be far better off lending his capital at zero interest or even at negative interest, because if he holds on to his capital, it's going to lose value with the passage of time. So
that's completely reasonable. The interest rate, the real interest rate, put it this way, is driven by the returns on real investments, physical, real goods and services. And my argument that historically, while we have seen negative real interest rates, often even for extended periods, the average real interest rate has been positive. That to me is simply a reflection of the fact that the real rate of return on investment, the marginal part of capital, if you want, is positive in most economies today. That is not a given, right? If we run into environmental constraints, if there are limits on biodiversity which we are violating and which are going to be subtracting from the productivity of our capital formation, we could end up in a world with a negative return to physical investment, a negative marginal part of capital, and therefore negative real interest rates. I completely accept that, but I don't think we're there yet. And we will find out, maybe a painful way, whether as I said, the environmental, ecological constraints on human economic activity will result in diminishing productivity of our physical capital formation processes. But so far, that has not been the case on average and on balance. So that's why we have needed negative nominal interest rates only occasionally during periods of extreme weakness of aggregate demand, when investment and other expenditures on real goods and services that are responsive to the interest rate need to be boosted more than it could be with the nominal interest rate at zero.
Okay, I'd like to defend Gassel's statement that I read a little bit more. It is my perception that there is not a general academic scientific consensus as to why interest exists. If you go into Google and you type in theories of interest, you will come up with at least 5 or 6 different explanations for the existence of interest. The leading ones will be the productivity theory, which you just referred to, which is that capital increases the productivity of labor, and therefore it is entitled to share in that increased produce. That's one theory. There's the time preference theory, which I think you sort of also alluded to. There's the fructification theory, which was Henry George's preferred theory, which ascribes interest to the productive forces of nature. But then there's Keynes, who I understand to essentially be a further development of Gusell's perspective, which is to make the case that interest is an artificial phenomenon which arises due to the advantages of money as a store of value vis-a-vis real tangible wealth that generally loses value with the passage of time, and that if money did not have that artificial advantage, that interest would not necessarily be positive, and it might be just as likely to be negative. So I'd ask you again. You're the professor of economics. I have a bachelor's degree in economics, so I would defer to you in terms of understanding the state of academic economics. But does the existence of the Keynesian liquidity preference theory not call into question your statement that the causes of interest are understood and agreed upon?
I don't think so. I do believe that the fundamental drivers of real interest rates are what I call the sort of intertemporal productivity of capital investment. That capital doesn't necessarily increase the productivity of labor. Even if there were no labor, you could have positive real interest rates, because the passage of time and improving technology could make capital more productive as time passes. Right? You don't even need labor for that. It is true that it is possible, as in Keynes's world, that the demand for money becomes all but infinite, right? When the interest rate hits zero or some low levels. That's a floor under interest rates. But the authorities can always, provided they get rid of some artificial asset with a zero nominal interest rate, they can always set the nominal interest rate on their own monetary liability and on short-term securities that they will buy and sell using their own monetary liabilities. They can set it at arbitrarily deep levels. I can imagine a world. There's nothing in conventional economic theory rules out, in principle, a world in which there will be persistent negative real interest rates. There's simply a world in which there's no strong taste argument, no strong time preference, and in which the marginal productive capital is negative, say because we run into environmental constraints. So negative real interest world could even be permanent. I don't think empirically we are there, but it's not illogical. Keynes wanted the monetary authority to set the rates on instruments denominated in terms of money, right? The short rate, the short overnight rate, to be deeply negative if that was required to stimulate aggregate demand to the full employment level. But he did not say that there was no no valid theory of interest rates. They're simply constraints on the ability of the authorities to implement the negative rates that were required to achieve full employment.
Giannis, I'll get to your question momentarily, but I want to continue with this topic. I did not say that Keynes made the case that there is no agreed upon theory of interest. I said that he proposed his own theory of interest, the liquidity preference theory, which, as I understand it, says that it essentially agrees with Cassell that positive interest is a monetary phenomenon caused by an artificial quality that our form of money has, which is its ability to be stored without loss. And you may very well be correct, and I agree with your analysis, which says that the existence of cash, which by definition, unless it's a stamped currency, yields a zero nominal interest rate. But we've never lived in a world without physical cash that yielded 0% nominal interest, and therefore, in a deflationary environment, is a superior form in which to hold wealth than any of the alternatives.
I agree, but that's why it's important to eliminate this asset and this floor on its interest rate. It should be the case that demurrage applies to cash, that it diminishes as you store it. With physical cash, that can be done, but only clumsily by stamping, things like that. With a digital currency, it can be done at the flick of the switch by simply saying it's -4% today, boys and girls. So I really think that Keynes was up against I think as much against an institutional barrier, the existence of this zero interest paper currency, which nobody at the time was even considering getting rid of, and the need to get to a negative nominal interest rate, which was made impossible by this zero nominal interest rate instrument. So I simply, in some ways, follow Keynes's logic by saying, yes, this is a floor created, a zero floor created by this strange construct of non-interest bearing physical cash. Let's get rid of it.
Okay. I do want to come back to this, but I want to let Giannis come back into the conversation. So Giannis, let me add you to the screen.
Hi, Giannis.
You're muted, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a very interesting conversation, and by all means, Josh, please do continue. But the discussion. But I wanted to pick a little bit on the concept that there is not enough aggregate demand, therefore we need to actually do a monetary injection. Is Willem? Is that do I
yes,
get?
That is my argument for needing the capacity to set negative nominal rates.
Right. Now, but have you thought why aggregate demand is stalling? In other words, have you thought, we used to have a certain amount of, let's say, circulating currency or specie, and somehow there is not enough of it. It kind of like disappeared. Now you seem to say, oh, because that species disappeared from the economy, and I need the economy to have more specie and currency to 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 spur the aggregate demand and activity and what have you. I'm gonna stamp more script in the traditional analog monetary sense, or with the stroke of two computer keys, you're gonna create that money in people's accounts. However, that doesn't solve the problem that the same mechanism that bled you dry is going to bleed you dry again. So maybe your strategy and your policy is actually helping those that are bleeding dry the economy, what we Georges call the rent collectors. Now I don't know if you're familiar with George, if you, but
Yes.
but you understand my point. So I think we try to solve a problem. We think we have a monetary problem. Well, actually, we don't have a monetary problem. We have a rent extraction problem.
Yeah, I know the Georgian argument, and it is not the way I would put things. Aggregate demand, let's think of a closed economy for simplicity, has sort of three broad components: government spending on goods and services, household consumption demand, and corporate investment demand, including inventories and all that. Those are the three components. And all three, even if they're normally at levels consistent with new full employment and on-target inflation, all three can be subject to significant and unexpected changes. In governments that have been at war for 10 years can unexpectedly achieve peace and government spending collapses. Households can lose confidence, become nervous about their future prospects, and in a sort of self-fulfilling way, restrict their demand for goods and services, which reduces the demand for labor, and which does indeed weaken their future wages and other income, which they are fearing in the first place. So it's a self-fulfilling element. And investment is inherently very volatile and driven by confidence factors, by perceptions of future government actions and all that. Now, so I have absolutely no problem visualizing a world that even when on average it is reasonably stable, near full employment equilibrium, can be subject to large undesirable fluctuations in aggregate demand, both up and down. And that can be tackled in two ways by the policymakers, either through monetary means or through fiscal means. I have no objection to fiscal stimulus when I can do so without violating the structural objectives of fiscal policy, desirable taxes, charges for public goods and services, and all that. But monetary policy is an alternative and desirable instrument because it works through the nominal interest rate and also through the availability of central bank money in a way that can stimulate broad layers of demand and restore equilibrium. So I have no problem in visualizing a world where the typical nominal interest rate would be positive, but in which in periods of below maximum employment, of inflation below target, of an expectedly low neutral real interest rate, or an expectedly strong overvalued external exchange rate, right, that would call for negative and possibly deeply negative monetary rates, not as something to live with forever, but for something to stimulate aggregate demand.
I hope you acknowledge that this theoretical prescription has been not applied in I would say I would put it polite, in an optimal way. I'd be very, very, very polite. And actually, it's been leading to an exacerbation of inequality and wealth concentration. Wealth concentration not because of competition, of like the capitalist virtues of competition, price discovery, hard work, and all that, but because of proximity to those central bankers and, of course, the adjacent banks that distribute this money. So, and let me close with this question. It would be kind of like an implementation question. Why would you object these monetary injections to be more democratically distributed? We can do it per household or per citizen, per worker, blah, blah, blah. And then let kind of have like a more like laissez-faire free economy, and will actually increase the agency of the economic participants at all levels, in the firm level, in the big firm level, in the worker level, all ages as well, become more agent and more actually responsible about the money, thinking that, wait, that's the money I have, I should be careful. And then they would be actually better, I think, economic agents, more prudent that way.
What you're describing is a mixed monetary fiscal stimulus, right? The central bank creates additional money. It could print it, or it could open an account for everybody, and then it distributes cash to people and firms, which is a government fiscal action. That's a transfer payment.
Sorry, right? let me clarify, Wilhelm. That's my fault. I didn't say I didn't mean to say firms. The firms will get it from the citizens as the citizens start distributing or satisfying their needs and desires. Just citizens, just individuals, no corporations, no.
It would be a household transfer payment made by the government, funded by the central bank. That's what we call helicopter money. Right? And
it's not funded by the central bank. It's a societal.
If it is cash that is handed out, then it has to come from somebody, and the central bank is the government provider of cash.
Well, the treasury. I mean, okay, the money printer. I mean, let's say
the money printer is. I view that as whatever. The central bank,
in other words,
is part of the treasury, right?
Right. Like what I'm trying to avoid, why I say you have to print the money and hand it out. Instead, what I don't want is the government say, I'm going to procure money through borrowing on the back of the unborn voters and citizens, and then I'm going to distribute it to the current people. That's what I don't want.
You're doing helicopter money. You are making a transfer payment which is funded by printing money.
It's funded by the society because that's going to lead to price increases.
Money. It comes out of a box, and it happens to be valuable because people think it has value. Yes. I'm all in favor I've written extensively on what I call helicopter money, which is these monetized fiscal stimulus, which means that you can cut taxes or raise public spending or increase transfer payments without incurring additional debt. But if you have a non-inflation environment, that makes eminent sense. Of course, it makes no sense if you have an inflation environment, in which case
and exactly that's why I'm against helicopter money before you figure out who bled you dry. You understand? I don't believe that you should do helicopter money if you don't figure out who holds the money that was circulating in the economy and suddenly disappeared. Because money doesn't disappear; it just goes into some people's pockets.
It's simply money is held idle. It's a store of value as well as money. Simply money is not being spent at the same rate it used to be spent because people are more cautious, more conservative. There's no conspiracy required. It is simply people hoarding.
If that's the case,
disorder assets.
Right. If that's the case, if people have stashed it and don't want to spend it, then
Yes.
the easy way is to say to retire. That's why I say that's easy to do with electronic money. I mean, yeah, okay, you can do it with negative interest rates, and then you can force the people to actually move it from their idle accounts. But with cash, you can say, I'm retiring the bills that you currently have in your pocket. I'm going to retire in a year. And then you're going to issue new ones. So people are going to be forced to do something with it, to get something of value
the government has
with
to
their
be
money.
able, you see, this is there's a very basic problem, even with stamping currency. You have an extreme version of that where you say you simply retire the money completely, take it out of circulation and introduce new money. But what if the government wants to retire money and people say, come and get it, right? And the government says it is no longer legal tender. The private sector says, I consider it to be as valuable today after you declared it non-legal tender as it was yesterday when it was legal tender. The value of the only way the government can get hold of the money may be through intrusive searches of people's pockets and safety boxes. So I would not recommend that. If you have electronic money, you can actually reduce the quantity by pushing a button, and the quantity really goes down because when it said 100 before, it now says 95. Right? That's different from having to tap somebody on the shoulder and say, show me your wallet. Do you still have any of your old notes? And if so, I will confiscate them and probably force you to spend a fortnight in jail. That's not the way monetary policy should work.
You don't need to do that then.
Yanis, we're going to need to move on. We've
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, we only got about 10 minutes left. As we are going over a lot of very important questions, it's clear to me we're not going to resolve them today, and the idea of perhaps doing another roundtable episode, like I referred to at the top, we would like to do as an ongoing feature of this series. Dr. Buiter, I will be in touch offline to see if you might be interested in coming back.
I would be honored. Yeah.
Participate in a more focused discussion, specifically on the subject of interest, why it exists, should it exist. And one of the people who I have in mind, who I would also invite to that discussion, is a guy named Ahmed Anwar. Are you familiar with him? He's a lecturer in economics at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote what I consider to be an excellent paper comparing the Gussellian and Keynesian perspectives on interest. I'd like to, if I could, read an excerpt from that paper,
Mm-hmm.
get your thoughts on it, and perhaps wrap up this episode on that note with an intention of bringing you guys together to go into this at greater length. So let me read an excerpt from Dr. Anwar's paper.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote, "It will be helpful for us to use a distinction that Soddy, 1933, makes between wealth and virtual wealth. Wealth is the product of harnessing the sun's energy to do useful work and is subject to physical laws. Virtual wealth, however, is a claim to this wealth that is supported by convention and law. We can think of a fiat currency as a debt that the community has to itself. Those who hold the currency have a claim on the wealth that the community holds. They are choosing to hold it as a claim rather than as physical wealth itself. We can then add to this private debt that is created through the banking system extending credit. The banks are creating claims against the community's wealth, but this is backed by private debt. Now, if we apply this to Gusell's description, when the government intervenes to prevent prices falling, they are issuing fiat money that is continually being hoarded. It is not circulating through the exchange system, so the gap in demand is simply being filled by new issue. This is just increasing the claims against the wealth of the community, and it is being willingly held because of the low interest rate. On top of this, there is all the private debt that is in the system, and as interest rates fall, the private credit contracts, and so all this is simply being converted to public credit. The endogenously created money is being converted to fiat money. For Gussell, the wealth is in the wares that are produced, and so we have increasing claims on the wares, and while there is faith in the currency, this virtual wealth can go on expanding and interest rates falling. Taking them past zero is just allowing the ratio between virtual wealth and wealth to grow further before the inevitable collapse." And then he goes on and says, "The source of the problem is the contradiction between money as a medium of exchange and a store of value, and creating more money when money is being hoarded to solve this problem is not a solution at all. History has taught us that it will always end the same way." Your thoughts?
I profoundly disagree with this. Clearly, it is true that money is virtual, what I would call a financial asset. We not talk about commodity money here, but both central bank money, and paper currency. The government, when there is a deficiency in aggregate demand, can meet this fiscally with monetary support. Right? It spends more, or it makes transfer payments to the private sector to spend more, which is funded by money creation in the central bank. You would have to do this continuously because there's a flow of spending that is weak. You haven't done anything to affect that, and you're simply making up for the shortfall. It requires continued money issuance. But that's because we do it at the same zero, I assume, interest rate for money. If I reduce the interest rate on money, make it deeply negative, then people will not have an incentive to hold money. And so you do not have to engage in constant fiscal transfers to keep demand active. The lower interest rate on money reduces money demand and stimulates investment and consumption demand, weakens saving. So I think it is what you described was again exercising helicopter money by the state. Right? A fiscal transfer to the private sector is funded continuously, quarter by quarter, year by year, by zero interest rate money creation. That's a possibility. I would supplement it or even replace it by cutting the nominal interest rate on money and getting people to give up on their hoarding. Right? Remember, money can only be a medium of exchange, a means of payment, if it is also a store of value. So it has to be both. But there are times where people overdo it on the store of value side, and you have to reduce the attractiveness of money as a store of value by offering deeply negative interest rates. Okay.
All right. Well, like I said, I think that this is a subject for another episode. We've got 2 minutes remaining. We've got a hand raised. So let's bring in a final question here from Joe. Joe, do you want to turn your camera on? If not,
yeah, I'm out. Yeah, I'm out. Sorry, I was late too for coming, and this was very interesting. Thanks so much for those comments. Quick question, maybe you discussed it. Professor, are you a supporter of a central bank digital currency?
Yes.
Okay.
Strongly.
we did discuss this.
Seem to fit what you described.
An interest-bearing central bank retail digital currency that can be used for payments online and offline, and it has no caps either on the size of the account or on the size of the transactions you can make. And I could do this either in a traditional centralized sort of account type way or in a DeFi way, both permissionless or permissioned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, let's leave it there. We're right at the 2-hour mark. Dr. Buiter, thank you so much. It was a privilege to get to pick your brain on these issues. I hope that we can do it again, and I will be in touch about possibly following up with this idea of a roundtable discussion more narrowly focused on the phenomenon of interest, because I certainly don't think we wrapped that subject up here today. So
thank you, Josh. It has been a pleasure and a privilege. And thank you, the whole audience, for putting up with me for this long. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.